Welcome to this lunchtime session. My name is Andrew Quinn. I direct the New Voices program here at the Aspen Institute. And I'm thrilled to be here because this is one of the ones in many, many interesting sounding sessions. This one sounds like it's going to be a real winner. Can we use public health strategies to combat violent extremism? I'm fascinated to hear what our panelists have to say. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to my old friend, Jackie Judd. Jackie.
Thank you, Andrew, old friend. We just met 10 minutes ago. Anyway, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for sharing your lunch hour with us. I'm delighted to see all of you. As Andrew said, he teed off what this is about, and I think that Aspen, one of the many great things that Aspen does is it does identify ideas that haven't quite burbled up to the surface, and I think that this panel is about one of those ideas. The idea is, do we apply public health tools to fighting violent extremism? It's clear that the conventional tools that the military, the national security community, local law enforcement use are simply not sufficient. So what can and should the public health community be doing? An interesting question that all of our panelists will help us answer. From my right, Omazine Khalifa is a Tunisian activist who is the founder and president of a nonprofit in her home country which identifies marginalized youth and tries to empower them through sparking their creativity. Prior to returning home, Omazine worked in France in finance, and then came the Arab Spring, and she decided to go back home to try to help build democracy there. Chris Kirchhoff is a partner in the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Unit X, or Unit 10. What is it? X. Unit X. That sounds like a story in and of itself, doesn't it? Unit X is based in the Silicon Valley. It tries to identify emerging technologies and then apply that to national security innovations. Prior to this, Chris previously served on the staff of the NSC in the Obama White House. And at the end there is Matt Winia. Matt is the director of the University of Colorado's Center for Bioethics and Humanities. He recently chaired a committee convened by the National Academies of Science to look at the very question we're going to be discussing. And so Matt, I'm going to start with you. Because I think this is a fairly new idea that not many in our audience may be familiar with, give us the big picture notion behind this. And
Sure.
Before you start, one thing.
Yeah.
I usually hate acronyms, but I'm going to allow everyone on the panel to use one acronym, CVE, Controlling Violent Extremism, because it seems to be very well used in this discussion. Go for it.
So that's an interesting choice of acronym to use because it's become quite a contentious term, actually. Countering violent extremism is the idea of thinking about acts of extremist violence as a sort of public health problem rather than a military or law enforcement problem. And that was the question that we posed at this meeting back in September is, what would it look like if we took, say, the case of a young person from Minneapolis who chose to go off and fight for ISIS? If we saw that as a public health dilemma or a public health problem rather than a national security or a military or a police problem. And it's in some ways very analogous to many other public health problems that we have looked at over the years, right? We have a whole sort of set of metaphors and stories that we tell about not wanting to wait until something bad happens to someone, right? A disease, an illness, but instead to move upstream. We have this metaphor in public health of the stream, right? Where there's an ambulance sitting by the side of the river and people are drowning and they keep pulling the drowning people out of the river. And finally, someone from public health says, why don't we go find out why people are falling in the river upstream, right? So that's the idea. And the terminology here is very challenging. Because while the terminology in public health can be challenging for a variety of reasons, the idea that we're talking about here is working in what they call the pre-criminal space. And you don't have to have seen very many sci-fi movies to be worried when someone says they're talking about you as a pre-criminal, right? So if your community is full of pre-criminals, that is a stigmatizing message. And this immediately raises all kinds of not only civil liberties concerns, but ethical concerns, and frankly, very practical concerns about the types of activities that can and should be undertaken when people haven't done anything wrong yet, but they're thinking about it. Or they've started to adopt an ideology that might justify the use of violence in pursuit of their political goals.
Did the committee end up, though, believing that there was some reason to look more deeply at this and try to make that convergence?
So I will say one thing, so the answer isn't exactly yes or no, but I will break it up into two parts. So on the one hand, there are tools of public health, there are assessment tools, there are methods of public health, there are conceptual models that we use in public health to address things like gang violence, domestic violence, suicide prevention. These are models and ways of thinking that are probably usefully applicable in this domain of preventing violent extremist acts. There is also the idea of asking people within the health and public health system to be a part of that task and to be on the lookout for people who are thinking about doing something violent but haven't done it yet. That makes me and many others much more nervous. So use of the tools of public health, absolutely, probably things to be learned there. And by the way, probably things public health can learn from the security environment and from people who've been doing research on counterterrorism as well. So I think there is learning across those fields to be done. The extent to which you want your doctor or the school nurse to be looking out for kids who might be at risk of becoming, of moving to Syria, that is a much more fraught question.
Okay, and we will get to it. Omazine, some of what Matt has just described, you've applied in your own work. Tell us how.
Okay. Let me start by just reacting to the CV acronym. You know, countering violent extremism, and there is also another acronym that I give to you, PVE, preventing violent extremism, CT, countering terrorism. These are acronyms that are very harmful to us on the ground who work in areas where youth can get radicalized. So we don't use them because they can be actually counterproductive. For example, imagine you go to a young person that you want to empower, as we do with Mobdi'oun, and all your narrative and storytelling about what you're doing is about preventing violent extremism. How do you think this young person would think? I'm a potential violent extremist.
They would run as fast as they could away.
Exactly. And the idea is not we're trying to fix something that is wrong with the youth that we're working with, but actually the idea is to empower them to become active leaders, change actors in their community.
So what is the language that you use, and how do you identify the young people who could most use your guidance?
So we use a positive narrative, actually like Daesh or Al-Qaeda. We propose something that could be attractive to youth, that empowers them, that gives them avenue for hope and concrete, let's say, future activities that can help them build their life and choose where to go when they grow older. And actually, the idea is not, we don't try to identify who can get radicalized. We work in an area that Ansar al-Sharia, a group that was listed terrorist group by the Tunisian government 4 years ago, because they went there and they thought that these youth can be attracted to this area. So we did the opposite approach. They chose it, so we went there to understand why. What are the vulnerability factors that made them see this place as a potential place to recruit youth? And they did recruit youth. So first of all, we start to understand what are these reasons. What make these youth vulnerable to Ansar Sharia? And we are discovering many things that are like beyond religion, as we can think here, and we hear a lot of things about Islam, and Islamophobia is on the rise. But actually, yes, these youth have, religion is very important in their life, and you can use it if they are vulnerable. But what we see is beyond religion, they have many other problems that can make them, let's say, attracted to any other possibility that is not the normal way, and it's not education, it's not getting a career, because these paths are close to them. So if we don't dig to understand what are these, let's say, vulnerability factors, we will never understand why they are attracted by a group like Ansar al-Sharia, and we will never we never find the right answer, and we will never propose to them the right solution that will make them prefer the positive path instead of joining a violent group.
We've talked already about the importance of language in this subject. So I'm wondering if you would consider what you do in the public health space, or do you call it something else?
We call it social inclusion, youth social inclusion, but I think it's very linked to the public health, because what we are discovering now while working with these youth is a lot of, let's say, factors that are related to their mental health. So I would quote like 3 things. The first thing that we're discovering, because they live in this area where Ansar Sharia is present, but at the same time they have lots of violence, drugs abuse, prostitution, illegal immigration. So all the violence is already there. And they have already this stigma from other areas. So they are seen as potential terrorists, potential drug dealers, and they have this low self-esteem, shame actually of belonging to that area. But at the same time, they have their own strategy to feel proud about it, So it's an ambivalent view of themselves, and I think it needs maybe some psychological help to see that this strategy, this coping strategy of feeling pride to belong to an untouchable place, it's not a healthy way of seeing yourself like this. So, and the second factor that I would quote is the family, the environment where they live in is, as I said, very violent outside home. But when we talk with them about their situation, their family situation, they never talk about violence. But what we discover is they're educated with violence within the house, and for them it's totally legitimized.
Within their homes.
Within their home. So domestic violence is present there, and from an early age, it's normalized for them in their homes. So I think someone who would follow up on that as a teenager propose to them to join Ansar Sharia, probably they would think, it's normal violence, it's part of life, and they wouldn't think it's something not normal. The third thing that I wanted to add is more, let's say, public health in general, not mental health, is their relationship with the state, with the local authorities. I said they live in this area that is highly neglected by the state. It was a slum before rehabilitation, but it's still very disenfranchised. And they see the state only as a repressive, with its repressive presence. In Tunisia, we were a dictatorship till 7 years ago. Now we are transitioning from dictatorship to democracy, and we're trying to build new relationship of trust. But they are only seeing the repressive arm of the government, and they don't see it at all as a social actor who is providing health, education, jobs, etc.
Okay.
So.
And Matt, I know some of that resonates with you, but Chris, I want to get to you first. As I mentioned in the intro, you come from the more conventional part of dealing with this crisis. So what does this notion of applying public health tools to what you currently do, does it make sense? Are you skeptical?
So I'm a strange duck in that I'm a social scientist by training who found myself in the unique role of advising the U.S. military on a variety of different policy topics. And I've been constantly surprised at how useful my social science training has come in handy. And there are a couple really interesting instances of the military turning to social science tools in the middle of very serious security crisis. One of the most recent of them is the Human Terrain Program, which was founded in the middle of the Iraq insurgency when people in the military and USAID and the State Department were just at their wits' end for how to work with communities to stabilize them, to get reconstruction going, and to take violent actors out of the picture, which is ultimately a deeply social and political phenomenon. And so the Human Terrain Program brought in anthropologists, brought in sociologists, brought in political scientists, brought in linguists to work with USAID, State Department, and US military personnel to understand the communities. They did a lot of almost ethnography, deep interviews. And I thought that was a really interesting experiment, a really interesting application of social science tools. I've also found, though, that the potential application of social science tools is a bit uneven, which really shouldn't surprise you, right? Because the military is its own profession, the profession of arms. And when you go to boot camp or to the police academy, for that matter, you're not expected to have a public health module as part of your training. So it's not surprising that there's a natural disconnect between the communities. And for that reason, I was really excited to be invited to be a part of this panel to explore whether there is a deeper bridge here on this particular topic that could be built.
Matt, Chris just used the word the application is uneven. How would you describe that? Because I think that you have seen actual pushback when there have been attempts to introduce the public health tools into this.
Well, so I'm not sure that there's pushback, but there probably are misunderstandings. And I would even say that if there is pushback, it may be on the part of public health people who are concerned with, I want to put this delicately, but there is an aspect of the sort of CVE, and I use that term advisedly. And by the way, just as a side note, in Boston, we heard this story at this meeting, 97% of community leaders said they would not participate in a program if it had the CVE label in it. So this isn't just in Tunisia, it's in the US as well, and unfortunately, that label has become toxic. And one of the reasons I think it has become toxic is because there is a sense that there are categories of people who deserve this extra scrutiny and attention, and that we can use science to figure out who those people are, and then target them for some kind of an intervention. And to date, there just are not good predictors. We had 2 days worth of discussions about this, and we do not have a risk model, a threat assessment model that is really good enough to use in what I would use a term a clinical sense.
So is your fear that public health officials could inadvertently get tied up in profiling?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you have to go back very far to find people in the health professions being misused within the military context, right? I mean, I'm sure that the psychologists at Guantanamo thought they were doing their best and trying to help the country. They were not, right? And I'm on a panel right now for the American Psychological Association trying to clean up that, which they see as an enormous professional mess at this point because of psychologists who thought they were using the tools of social science in pursuit of national security goals, which they saw as legitimate national security goals. So when you start to mix clinical care and public health sorts of mindsets with security mindsets, I think there is going to be some friction there. And it's not an unhealthy friction, by the way. I am not saying that we should not work together. But I'm saying there are going to be some challenges. And incidentally, one of the challenges is going to be funding legitimate research in this area, right? It's very difficult to get a political body, the state, to fund research on what is, in many senses, a fundamentally political activity.
Do you have problems finding funding?
Actually, it's a you just put your finger on the on the problem. Actually, traditional donors have usual silos for funding nonprofit activities, and silos are, for example, education, health, employment, youth empowerment. But when you want to have a research, for example, as we are doing with a group of sociologists to understand what is wrong, but also what are the resilience factors of these youth and what we can propose to the government, to private sector and NGOs, you don't find a donor that is willing to participate, especially that you're proposing something new, very innovative, that mixes social science with anthropology, with radicalization, with gender, and with social psychology. And for us, it took us 2 years to convince 2 donors. Actually, we had a seed grant with $3,000 to start some focus groups with youth that showed very surprising results. And another donor wanted to join in, so we multiplied by 10 our small grant. And this is how we were...
Surprising results in what way?
For example, the 3 ones that I quoted about the individual level, the family level, and the community level reaction that we found with youth. And actually what happened is that we needed to be flexible. We needed to test and adjust our methodology, and donors are not ready to do that unless they trust you as a person and they believe that it needs to be innovation and creativity in that area, so they know what has been done. They know that there is lots of theory that has been decades of security policies that led us to where we are today, so maybe we should change something. But for sure, we're still starting this conversation on how to get funds for new researchers that are really locally rooted to understand what can lead a youth to join a radical, violent extremist organization.
Chris, you wanted to jump in on this funding question?
Yeah, well, I'd say a couple things. One, the U.S. military is arguably the strongest proponent of any sort of preventive program. So you'll find people in the military that are actually the fiercest advocates of foreign aid because they know that if foreign aid fails, instability may flow from that.
Right, and we've heard that argument because of the proposed cuts to the State Department.
And you have a number of people like former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mike Mullen, standing up and saying, no, we cannot afford to do this. And so similarly, on the CVE front and on the understanding terrorism front, in the wake of 9/11, the Department of Defense actually started a social science research fund called Minerva that has funded a number of economists, sociologists, and political scientists to try and conduct empirical studies. Because as Matt mentioned, this is a field that is very methodologically difficult to come up with clean results in, and this is why here we are, 16 years after 9/11 with frustratingly vague answers on core questions. But the other thing I'd like to say too is, the other side of, I think it's incredibly important for academic disciplines, for professional associations to be very reflexive and aware of what they're participating in. But the other side of that, of the coin, right, is, the anthropologists riding around in Humvees with with protective gear on them, doing their best to diffuse an impossibly violent situation at great personal risk to themselves. We're doing their best. And they were censured by their professional association. Which of course comes out of a legacy of having been involved in things in the colonial era that are very important to still think about today. So this is not going to be an easy bridging of cultures, but I think it's a necessary one.
Matt, did you want to jump in?
I think you're entirely right. It is a really difficult, and the thing that would be wrong would be to move forward without awareness of these risks and without awareness of the legacy problems, right? I was also going to mention that there are some reasons why you'd rather not have the state funding some of these types of activities, right? We, again, heard this from a number of organizations, and you may recall there were some grants given out for this type of work, and a number of the recipients of those grants actually sent the money back after the election because they no longer wanted to receive government funds to do this kind of work in a Muslim community when Islamophobia seemed to be the rule of the day. That taking money from the government, even to do a good project, it could turn into a not good project because of the source of the funds. And that's a sort of just a very difficult dilemma in terms of where to get funding for this, because the people who do care about this, including those in the military where they have lots of money, I'm saying this, But folks,
about
right, the
Unit X?
military, Unit X, has some money to put towards this, and yet that money may not be the best source from the point of view of a grassroots organization that is trying to build trust and empower a local community, right? So where you could get funds, you wouldn't want that money because it would put at risk the trust building exercise that you're trying to undertake.
Did you want to?
Yes, I wanted to add something. Actually, we are talking a lot about research, and maybe in people's minds it's about a theory and like academy research. But I would like to say that it's our context in Tunisia that made us start by doing a research. We didn't have enough data in this area. Violent extremism is traditionally seen as a security matter. So even if there is data, it's not available to public and NGOs, etc. So this is where we started to collect our own data and from a sociology perspective. But I would like to add also that we might want to look in conflict zones, in post-conflict zones, and fast transitioning countries where women have been doing initiatives for a long time now, not because they were victims or they didn't choose to be perpetrators of violence, but they became leaders of innovative and creative activities with youth, with the religious leaders, because they had a high stakes, I mean, the safety and the security of their own community. So another type of research would be to go and see what they are doing and if it is efficient, and now we can also improve our monitoring and evaluation tools in this area where we need to evaluate what we are doing and if it is efficient and if we're correctly really improving people's life and so the safety and security of the communities.
One of the things that has struck me about the conversation so far is how each of you in your own way has returned to some notion of the distrust that exists between various players in this sphere, between community leaders and people who may come in from the outside, law enforcement, public health officials, the military, and the public health community. What are some specific strategies you could think of to try to turn the distrust into trust?
So this is an area where public health does have maybe something to offer, and folks within the security arena have already been working on this, right? So if you look at some of the activities in terms of community resilience building, including things funded by the military and law enforcement, they look just like a community-based participatory research project in public health, right? They're sitting down with local community leaders, they are hashing out an evaluation plan together, they're looking at the data together and deciding how to interpret the data together, deciding what to do with the data together, how to move the project forward to its next step together in collaboration with a group of local community leaders. That sounds just like a gang violence prevention activity. It sounds just like a suicide prevention activity. It sounds just like an anti-bullying activity, right? These sort of restorative justice type approaches where grievances are laid on the table and taken seriously. I think this, incidentally, is one of the challenges of the CVE paradigm, is that some of the things that drive people to become violent are legitimate grievances. So in the counterterrorism arena, the things that people have found to drive people to commit terrorist acts, so setting aside the sort of public health activities, just the things people mention are Guantanamo and torture and invasions, and right? Those things don't show up by and large in the CVE framework, because those are political acts and policy decisions that comprise legitimate grievances. So somehow we have to have a way for communities and individuals who actually have legitimate grievances to be able to talk about those. By the way, we don't have to think about Islamic at all.
At the community level.
Yes, right. And it happens not just with regard to Islamic radicalization, right? This is gang violence, right, and mistrust of the police among many communities in the United States. So these are very comparable sorts of activities. They're very challenging. There is no silver bullet. These are not the kind of things where you have one scientific tool that you come in and use, and now you're done. These are what we call complex adaptive challenges.
The Muslim Public Affairs Council in the United States in 2014 launched a program called Safe Spaces, and it had 3 layers of activity. The first being prevention. One part of that is making a mosque, for example, a place of community and comfort and safety. The second is intervention if people are identified as potentially dangerous. And the third is to alert law enforcement if the first 2 haven't worked. How do those programs work, Matt? What's your experience?
Well, so I'm speaking only to other people's experience because I have not implemented these programs. So I'll tell you what we learned over the course of this 2-day meeting. The Safe Spaces looks something like the British approach, I would say. Do you think that's accurate?
The British, are in some ways very much ahead of us.
Yeah. But a number of countries in Europe are ahead of us in a few ways and for a few reasons. They have been dealing with this for longer, and they've got a lot of people returning now who have been fighters, and now they're dealing with reintegration. Politically, we are nowhere close to being able to talk about reintegration in this country, I don't think.
Chris, how are the British ahead of us? What do they do?
The British have a very different mentality for internal security. So we make a lot of distinctions in our government between the authorities that are used to protect the nation, to collect intelligence to protect the nation, and then to do local law enforcement. And that stems from the fact that we divorced ourselves from Britain at a certain point and wrote a Bill of Rights. So the coordination you see in the British security apparatus is much stronger, and as a result of that, I think with the national security apparatus in Britain looking outward at the incredible volume of returnees, who some of whom have of course gone on to commit grievous acts of violence, all the way down to that local level of community engagement. And remember, the British police officers for the most part don't carry guns. It's just a different approach to community policing. So, for instance, the British government was one of the first to start a center focused in particular on the digital aspects of radicalization, and to really focus on extremist content that's proliferated on websites, and to combat it. They were, again, ahead of the US by quite a bit.
Oh, Mazin, did you want to jump in on this?
Actually, I wanted to react because you started by quoting the Muslim Council, right, initiative. Yeah. And I would like to stress out that it's not about religion. And actually, if we look at the figures in the United States, between 1965 and 2013, 43% of the radicalization is from the extreme right, the far right, whereas 13% only come from Islamists. So let's make it like religion can be a factor to, let's say, mobilize people who have grievances, sometimes legitimate
and this point
grievances.
is exactly the right one to interject in the security context.
And Matt
right?
made the point that this is larger than
Absolutely.
that. It's about gang violence. It's about violence that comes or is triggered by many different sources.
During our meeting, we had a slide that showed the predictive factors for becoming involved in a gang and predictive factors for becoming involved in Al-Qaeda or Daesh. And they're exactly the same. I mean, exactly the same.
Yeah.
So these are factors that lead to violence and lead to acts of violence. They're not unique to one or another. And incidentally, we heard repeatedly that if you create a countering violence program that targets only Muslims, that program is as likely as not to at least be ineffective and maybe to backfire and drive, right? Because one of the things that drives people to violence is feeling stigmatized and discriminated against. So now you've created a program in an effort to do one thing, and you get blowback, right? Because the program in the end stigmatizes and discriminates.
Yeah. And coming back to the strategy, which was the second part of your question, I completely agree with you on when we work within the communities, actually giving voice to the voiceless, because these are the youth that we are working with. They don't participate in any political process. They don't trust any institution. And they told us, you know, you're the first association that is talking to us. Finally, somebody is listening to us. So we don't see any solution without their say in it. So the first thing that we're going to do when we will end up the research that we are doing is to present it to them first, to have their priorities, to see if they agree with the results that are there. And actually, they are the people that we are interviewing. So we have focus groups with teenagers between 12 and 18 years old. We have also have a questionnaire with 400 of them, and to be sure that we have a representation of the youth community there, but still we want to check that what we're saying reflects what they're feeling and work with them on building an action plan within the community.
And you focused earlier on the importance of evaluation. I know that your nonprofit is relatively new, but do you know whether you are succeeding, and what is your definition of success?
We are in early stage to evaluate if we are succeeding, but the first thing that we've done is to have this, let's say, evaluation of our own actions and indicators of result that we're going to measure. But the whole metrics that we've done to measure our work is a tool, a living tool. It's going to evolve with our action, because we know that what we're doing is unprecedented and that we need to be very careful that we are not doing the opposite, as you said, creating any kind of backlash. For example, what we imagine is that we go question these youth, we publish our research on our own, and then we brag about what we found out, but we create expectations that we weren't able to fulfill, so they have even more, they lose trust even in public actors like us. So we're still at an early stage, but we know that we need to be careful on how to measure efficiently what we're doing on the way.
One last question to you, and then I want to open it up to all of you in the audience. So if the folks with the microphones can start circulating, that would be great. Going back to the National Academies meeting, were there specific next steps? What happens from here that the group recommended or chose to stay away from?
So I don't want to sound like I'm whining, but I will say,
We all
I
whine.
will say that the National Academy staff were amazing, pulling this meeting together, very committed, and they have tried to pursue next steps, and there has just been no support from external funders. So this has been, and that has been, and I include by external both governmental and non-governmental funders to pursue some of the next steps that we did lay out.
Okay, well, important to know. Thank you. Are there questions in the audience? Raise your hand and someone with a microphone will come over to meet you. Hi there, can you let us know who you are? And if you're here with an organization, let us know that as well. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
No, we cannot.
Check. Yes.
Okay, just
good
speak up.
afternoon. I'm Farah Nazafaq, and I'm an intern at Aspen Institute this summer. So I'm originally from Afghanistan, by the way, and I'm a 24-year student in Wofford College, South Carolina, an international student. I spent 19 years of my life running away from violence, from war, from my country, from my family, in order to seek education, in order to make my future better. How and why then, if public health is important and getting rid of violence, then why the United States is not supporting public health in order to make a change or bring positive changes in countries, underdeveloped countries, such as Afghanistan, rather than sending atom bomb or military. And I think this question specifically goes to Mr. Matthew. Sorry, I cannot read your last name. It was so hard, but I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, Matt, you can take it, but I also think that, Chris, you may want to say a word or two.
So what I will say is that one of the concerns in this whole arena is that there are legitimate grievances that we are papering over by trying to make people more resilient. And so instead of addressing the grievances, we're trying to ensure that people don't become violent as a result of those grievances, so that the grievances can go on, right? So if there's some unfair, unjust, bad situation, one approach is to try and address that. Another approach is to teach the people who are facing that bad situation to survive better, right, without turning to violence. And that's kind of how the CVE thing has been framed, at least in some audiences, is this is about avoiding conversation about the policy decisions that are creating the environment in which people start to see violence as a legitimate option.
And I'd just say very briefly that, look, Afghanistan illustrates the just how tragic and difficult and vexing issues of brain stability to a place can be. But I will say, to give not only the United States government a bit more credit, but also the many allies and partners and nonprofit organizations and charities that are active today in Afghanistan, that my sense is that people are doing their best to come up with an integrated approach. So yes, of course, there are some very serious hard security concerns today in Afghanistan still. But USAID also has a large footprint there, and a lot of their approaches are deeply sociological and deeply public health based in some respects. Afghanistan was a place that the human terrain teams operated very aggressively. But again, the world is not an easy place. And the reality of the world we live in is a very small number of people can destabilize an enormous area, which is, of course, why the conversation we're having today is so important.
Yes.
Incidentally,
yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say this is not, this is maybe another area where public health and preventing violent extremism are analogous, right? We spend an enormous amount of money in medical care and a tiny amount on public health. We also spend an enormous amount of money on the military and a little bit on USAID.
Mm-hmm. Is there a question on this side? Yes, back there. Someone's coming over with the mic.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, thank you for the panel. This is a really important subject. So I had a question. You talked a lot about how do we identify these youth that could potentially be radicalized? What can we do with them? I'm curious, do we need to shift a little bit and think, what can we do with us in terms of the narrative that's here, how we think, which I think could lead to some of those actions that lead to some of those grievances. So I'm just curious, what can we do with us?
So one of the things that you're raising, in my mind at least, is the reality that we heard very early in the National Academies meeting that there is no predictive model. So there is no screening test that is clinically useful for who's on the path towards violence, towards an act of violence. There are many, many people who hold violent ideological thoughts and never act on them. And picking those who are likely to act versus those who are not likely has just been impossible to do, essentially. So in public health, when we don't have a screening test that works clinically, we start thinking exactly as you are about, so what are the ways in which we can make it harder for an act of violence to occur because we've created an environment in which guns are less readily available. Or we say, you know what, we have a very difficult time predicting who's going to commit suicide. But we know that if we build a fence next to the bridge, suicide rates will go down. So you start thinking about environmental interventions rather than targeted interventions to individuals. So I like the way you're thinking. I don't have the answers, but that is maybe one of the ways that public health's sort of way of thinking about things could conceivably be helpful here, is in reframing the how do we detect and prevent an individual from becoming violent to how do we change the entire, how do we shift the curve is what we talk about in public health, right? So we're no longer trying to just find 3 people who are going to act. We're trying to move the entire behavioral curve to one side.
Almazy?
Yes, just to, I think what we are saying also here is that this is not a conversation about security issues. We cannot have a conversation about terrorism and preventing violent extremism within the military, law enforcement, intelligence collaboration only. We are all concerned by this in every sector. Public health is a major one, but I see also education, I see the economy, the employment, everything that, as you said, indirectly could lead any person that feels marginalized, not included, become having frustration growing, anger, and maybe become violent. But addressing the indirect reasons that could lead to that, and from all sectors, is what needs to be done. From the donor's perspective, it needs also, to, let's say, narrow the distance between what is considered as security and what is considered as development, because they are both really tight. So we need to think about new instruments for funding initiatives that are, for example, see community empowerment, investing in communities as a tool for preventing violent extremism, and not only just empowering youth for empowering youth or empowering women for empowering women,
There's a question up here.
Am I live?
Yeah,
Karen
now you are.
Bartolome, the Denver World Affairs Council. And my question has to do with domestic extremism, and you touched on that, I think, a little bit. But how are these techniques applied to the kind of people that are, going into a church in Charleston or burning down Portland, Oregon? I mean, how do you see that specifically being moving forward as an issue?
So I think I'll reiterate something that Omazine said a moment ago, which is if you look across the last 40 years, so including the early 1970s when there were waves of bombings from far left extremists, so across a large time span, about 43% of acts of extremist violence have come from the far right, 20-something% have come from the far left, and 13 or 15% have come from Islamic extremists. So we have extremists, and there are also individual single-issue extremists, which comprise another 5 or 10%. So we've got a range of reasons why people commit acts of violence as a result of some kind of ideological belief system that they hold. And the most promising programs, I think, are probably the ones that look across the board, rather than targeting one or another. So within our country, Islamic extremism has not been an enormous problem insofar as it has caused violence and death, in smaller proportion than other types of ideologically motivated violent acts. But we spend a lot more time thinking about that. So if there is a way to bridge that, and what we heard, several times was this should all be encompassed under a violence prevention initiative. And that sounds appealing, but I don't know that I buy that that's the only way to go about it either, because after all, there are communities, and the community may feel like they have something within their community that ought to be addressed, that may or may not be important in this other community, which is also dealing with a violence problem.
There's a question.
That's not an answer. It's just to say this is really complicated.
Yes, gentleman in the blue shirt. Mike's coming over to you.
Hi, I'm Bob Wales from San Diego. And I have a question. This is a really interesting conversation, and it kind of points toward the importance of prevention at some level and the importance of the community interaction before violence starts. And you've already mentioned that there's many different approaches to that. Some of this has to be the sociologic approach of understanding the roots of violence. And of that, family has to be a common denominator with so many. Can each of you maybe comment a little bit about gender inequality and the importance of having better gender equality for a high-functioning family and decreasing violence with that issue?
Interesting question. Omazine?
Yes. I like that. Actually, thank you for raising this question, because gender inequalities is crucial in the research that we're doing and actually what we're discovering with these youth. You have to know that the area that we're working with has huge disparities between men and women's roles. And we are trying actually to understand how does masculinity behavior shifts in an area where the men are highly marginalized in a society that is highly patriarchal. So men are seen as providers, as protectors, as reproducers, but at the same time, we have 15% of unemployment in general. We have 31% of university graduates who don't have a job. So men cannot act like normal men, I would say, in our society. So how do they express their masculinity? Could they be respected in their community, where they're not anymore those who provide the social status in the family, and where they cannot pay for, actually sometimes they cannot get married because they can't afford to get married. So we are seeing that there is a type of violence that is raising because of that. But still we are at an early stage to draw conclusions on that. On the other side, we see that the public space is occupied by men, and women are present in the private space. So there is a huge difference when we see that in the family, the women are taking most of the decisions, and that the youth rely on their moms for religious guidance, for who they have to meet and who they don't have to meet in their education as well. So we're thinking about rebalancing the gender norms, but it's still at an early stage. But for sure, you touched really a point that is very important, and we are exploring it right now.
And is it part of the conversation you have with the kids who come to your organization?
Absolutely, okay. Yes.
I know you wanted everyone to answer, but we're running short of time, so if there's another question in the audience, I would like to go there.
To the left.
To the left. Raise your hand. There you are. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jemima Njuki. I'm from Kenya. I had a very related question. So, Omazen, you mentioned the role that women are playing in conversations about countering violent extremism, especially at the family level and the community level. But then when you look at the continental processes, there are very few women that are involved in the peace and security discussions, either with IGAD or with the other continental bodies. And in fact, recently, in an African Women's Leadership Forum in New York, that became the topic of conversation. How do we get more women to sort of rise from this very private space where they've been dealing with this at community level to start playing a more prominent role in the continental discussions around peace and security? So what is it that needs to happen for that to actually work?
Chris?
So I'll take a swing at this. I've been in the military in a really unique time, at a time that the military has taken on gender issues like never before, both sexual assault and harassment, but also gender equality and roles in the military. And what's really interesting to me about it, it was almost a post hoc recognition that women were in fact already in combat, already performing essentially every mission you could. And when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs announced this policy change, he told a story that was actually probably already 10 years old. He said, when I was the first commander in 2003 in Baghdad, we were getting ready to go on our first tour around the city. So I got in my Humvee, and I slapped the leg of the gunner, and I asked, are you ready to go on this mission? And she said, yes, sir, I am. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch the results of what happens when you have increasing numbers of women in all roles in the military, including flag officer roles, who are at the policy-making table.
I would like to add that there is a UN resolution, the 1325, that is about women, peace, and security, that tries to have more women in the security sector and recognize their role in preventing violent extremism. I am personally part of a global alliance called WASL, Women Alliance for Security Leadership, that connects women who are in these zones of war or post-war and who are already doing initiatives. They didn't wait, for lots of researchers, and we are globally connected and locally rooted exactly as the violent extremist organizations are. So, and we are basically saying that solutions need to come from the ground, but we also need to be connected globally to influence the policies that are being made on security and on development, and that we need to be having resources also that are going to women peace builders at the local level. So now it's the step forward to be recognized at the global level as peace builders and actors in this area.
Well, I started this conversation an hour ago saying we are going to be addressing an emerging idea, and I think it's clear that that's exactly what it is, that there is more work, talk, discussion, and maybe funding to be had.
You think my whining work?
Well, we're going to see, right? But I do want to thank each of you for coming. You came the farthest from Tunisia, so I want to say a special thank you. Thank you to all of you for being a great audience.